Hello, my name is Peter Shields, and on behalf of AirMet Scientific, I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar, New Directions in Sampling, Highlights from the AIOH CES, to be presented by someone who needs no introduction in Australia, the famous Debbie Dietrich, Vice President and CIH at SKC. So over to you now, Debbie.
Okay. Well, good morning, Australia, and welcome to this intercontinental training event. It is actually 8 p.m. in Texas, so and there's still a little bit of light out on this beautiful spring day. In this webinar, I thought I would present some of the highlights of the CES I did in Canberra. So, like my CES, this webinar is entitled New Directions in Air Sampling. Now, before we get to the presentation, I wanted to share with you kind of I think is a funny story. I was not the one that actually came up with this title of New Directions in Air Sampling. Someone at AIOH, came up with it. They knew basically what I was going to talk about. And when I actually was looking at the program online, I thought, wow, I saw the title of my CES and I thought, wow, that is a really great title. I really loved this. And in fact, the title really made me pause and think, what drives sampling in new directions? I thought, wow, now that's a really deep subject. And after some reflection, I came up with some key factors that really drove the content of my presentation. So here's my take on what drives sampling in new directions. First, a change in how we define and ultimately measure the hazard. New types of materials in the workplace and in the indoor environment that create new hazards. New health-related data that creates new concerns about the risk and subsequently new exposure levels for those target compounds. And finally, sampling technology itself advances to meet the current requirements. Now, so let's begin today by talking about the biggest driver for new directions in sampling of particulates, ISO 7708. Speaking as Dusty Debbie, as I call myself, as do many others, I feel that this standard, honestly, is probably the single most significant sampling development throughout my entire career, 7708. It changed how hygienists globally define particles in the workplace, moving our profession from the traditional definitions of so-called total dust and respirable dust to the new definitions of inhalable, thoracic, and respirable. Now, along with the new definitions of particle sizes came the development of new samplers to collect these particulate fractions, right? And looking at this slide, you can see some of the new samplers that emerged from ISO 7708. This is why I feel like it was so significant. So today I want to share with you some information on sampling innovation that continues today. I want everybody to always, as I always tell Peter, I want to be sure every single person learns something. So first I want to talk about, I think of an interesting new focus area, sampling of mixed phase contaminants. I've been studying and reading a lot about this lately. These are air contaminants found simultaneously in the aerosol and vapor phase. Okay. Now, this phenomenon may occur simply because of the chemistry of the compound, the vapor pressure. Oftentimes, however, compounds are found in mixed phases due to the job activity, such as spraying pesticides. if someone is spraying pesticides in a room, you could be inhaling the droplets and you could be inhaling the vapors simultaneously. Now, sampling mixed phase contaminants is challenging because during the sampling period, the distribution of the phases may change. Aerosols evaporate, vapors condense. So given the challenge of this kind of sampling and the potential for inconsistency, a European standard was passed on this subject actually in 2014. It's EN 13936. It requires that sampling for mixed phase contaminants be done in a way that represents the sum total of vapor and aerosol. Okay, so whatever phase it's in, you're still capturing it. Okay, that makes sense. But you may ask a simple question. How do you know you're evaluating a mixed phase contaminant? Yeah, good question. You can get some help from the TLV booklet. And this is if you have the same version in Australia that we have in the US, in the latest one, this is on page 72 and 73. The TLV booklet says, and just what it reads, I have on the slide, compounds that exert sufficient vapor pressure such that they may be present in both particle and vapor phases, again, aerosol droplets and vapor, are assigned a TLV with the inhalable fraction and vapor designation. If you've looked at the TLV booklet for many years, you will see that some compounds have a little, I think it's a superscript, IFV. The TLV booklet, and that, IFV stands for inhalable fraction and vapor. The TLV booklet also notes that you should consider both particle and vapor phases to assess exposures from things like spraying operations. Just the job activity can create a multi-phase contaminant. Other things are processes involving temperature changes that may affect the physical state of the compound. Or when a significant fraction of the vapor is dissolved into or absorbed onto particles of another substance. This is all directly from the TLV booklet. Now here's some compounds to give you some good ideas. These are compounds that have the TLVs issued with the IFV designation. So many pesticides have the IFV designation. Again, for the reason I already mentioned, you're typically spraying pesticides. I've gotten requests for things like Cresol, and in the petrochemical industry, there's a lot of interest in sampling for the multi-phase diesel fuel. Another big one is toluene diisocyanate. Okay, so those are the compounds that have the IFV TLV. Now, here are some operations that may generate mixed phase contaminants. When we look at metal coating operations, and even mentioned in fertilizer manufacturing, inorganic acids can be present, like hydrochloric, nitric, sulfuric, phosphoric. Again, they could be droplets, they could be vapor. Amines, like triethanolamine, are used as surfactants and corrosion inhibitors, and as cooling lubricants in metalworking industries. And if you work in the military, explosives like TNT and DNT can be as multi-phase contaminants, to name a few. Okay, so throughout our profession, we've dealt with mixed phase contaminants to some degree. And the traditional way that hygienists have sampled is shown on this slide. In my very first job after graduate school, my very first hygiene job, I was working for the Houston Health Department, and I was sampling chlordane pesticide in homes. Chlordane is used for termite control. And what we use, the old traditional way of sampling multi-phase contaminants, a 37 millimeter pre-filter followed by a sorbent tube connected in line. This is a nightmare sampling train. It's difficult to assemble. I mean, it's just the simple stuff. The right size tubing that will fit over the smaller sorbent tube, yet then we'll have to sleeve it to fit over the inlet to the filter cassette. And of course, then you're carrying around this big thing throughout the day in the field. It's not particularly convenient. Well, then later, to kind of overcome that old traditional sampling train, in the 1980s, actually 1986 for US OSHA, they came out with a brand new tube, which everyone, hailed as like a major breakthrough in mixed phase sampling. And this was what we call the OSHA Versatile Sampler, or OVS tube. It is a fairly fat tube, 13 millimeter outer diameter. And the beauty of this tube design, I think it was very innovative at the time. It has an internal filter to trap any droplets, as well as two sorbent layers. What in this slide is the white, and the black is the sorbent separators. The filter is typically either glass fiber or quartz filter, depending, on the method and the target compound. A typical flow rates of 1 liter per minute through this fat tube. Aerosol droplets will collect onto the filter, and vapors will collect onto the sorbent. If by chance those aerosols hit that filter and then vaporize, no problem. They will still be trapped onto the sorbent. There are now both US OSHA and NIOSH methods using this OVS tube. SKC makes and sells a lot of them. They're used for things like pesticides, again, explosives, TNT, DNT, and glycol, including ethylene glycol. Now, the OVS tube was a big breakthrough, but the particulate collection is not designed to match the inhalability curve in ISO 7708. Really, US OSHA has not even adopted the concept of inhalable sampling. They're still doing total dust. And so I frequently get asked questions for collection efficiency data for the filters in the OVS tube. This information is simply not available. It is not given in US agency methods. It was just put in there to just trap it and then analyze it. We have no information on collection efficiency and relative to ISO 7708 at all. So some new samplers were needed for the new European standard. Why? Because the European standard requires not only simultaneous sampling of the vapor and aerosol phase, but true inhalable sampling of the aerosol phase. And again, this is consistent with the TLV, the IFV designation. It's inhalable fraction and vapor, not just aerosol, just generic aerosol. It is inhalable fraction. Now, the first multi-phase sampler to trap the true inhalable fraction and vapor was developed by a German agency. You may have heard of it. The first one was called the GGP. This first GGP had a flow rate of 3.5 liters per minute. Honestly, I don't know who thought of that. That is a very high flow rate to try and trap vapors. At 3.5 liters per minute, the vapors are going to blast right through the sorbent tube and not stick at all. So later, they came out with the GGP Mini sampler that is shown in this slide. This sampler actually, I have one that we purchased that I have right in front of me. This has 3 different sampling head options for use. The highest flow rate that they have was up to 500 milliliters per minute. And they use in this one a 13 millimeter filter. It's a very small filter, but designed for the true inhalable fraction. Now, SKC scientists, we have our own PhD aerosol physicist. He felt that he could make some improvements to the GGP Mini design. And SKC has developed and will soon, probably in the next month, release a new sampler for this application. I had the joy of naming the new baby the IFV Prep, after the TLVs, really for which it is used. SKC scientists decided to use the familiar IOM style inlet. The German sampler is like after that CES sampler, some of you may know, but our sampler is going to be with an IOM style inlet, with a collection onto the same size filters you use in the IOM, 25 millimeter filters, rather than 13 millimeter filters in the GGP Mini. The inlet of this sampler is uniquely sized for a flow rate of 1 liter per minute. And again, our aerosol physicist has shared with me some of the original research data by the inventors of the IOM noted that if you have a specified inlet velocity, the sampler will match the inhalability curve even at flow rates other than the 2 liter per minute we use with the IOM. So again, this sampler is 1 liter a minute. Why? Because we don't want to blast the vapors through. We need to have a flow rate where you can effectively reach out and grab those particles and put them onto the filter, but yet low enough to allow to trap the vapors without blasting them through the tube. So look for this new sampler in May. We are giving a paper on this at the American Conference. Okay, now on to our next topic. ISO 7708 also set a new direction for respirable dust samplers by issuing new performance criteria shown on this slide. And again, for those some of you that are experienced, this will be a review, but we have some, some newer people here. Shown on this slide again, this is ISO 7708 for respirable dust samplers. It is a collection efficiency curve. Okay, if you just look at this curve and go down to the x-axis particle aerodynamic diameter, if you look at a particle, a small particle, say 2 micron diameter, go up to the curve and you can see that ISO 7708 says that sampler should be 95% efficient in trapping that super small particle. Now, if you get down to larger particles, say 9 micron, the sampler only has to be about 5% efficient to still meet ISO 7708, since it's a larger particle. So again, there's a lot of data points on this curve. For simplicity's sake, our profession typically refers to one data point on the curve, and that's what we call the 50% cut point. And again, for you beginners, you will hear this term throughout the rest of your sampling life. This is the size of dust that the sampler collects with 50% efficiency. So let's look again back at the curve. We go to 50 on the y-axis and then drop down. You can see that the 50% cut point is 4 micron. The sampler should collect 4 micron particles with a 50% efficiency. As particles get smaller, it becomes more efficient. As the particles become larger, it becomes less efficient. Now, there's a lot of samplers out there to meet ISO 7708. Mainly what we've used for respirable dust since the beginning of time is cyclones of various types. Again, for any of you beginners, it is very important to note that each cyclone on the market has a unique designated flow rate to meet ISO 7708. Be sure to sample at the flow rate for your cyclone. If you sample at the wrong flow rate, your data is meaningless. We don't know what you have. Sadly, this is a common mistake with people new to air sampling. They don't understand that there's different flow rates for different cyclones, and I'm sad to say I am sure people have gotten fired over this for collecting meaningless data for a few years. Now at this point, I do want to advise, as I've received questions, even emails this week, that SKC Limited, who manufactures the plastic cyclone widely used in Australia, they have contracted with an outside agency to revalidate the performance relative to ISO 7708. There have been a number of, publications and researchers that have raised some questions on the performance of the device relative to ISO 7708. So Limited is having it retested. I was copied on a couple emails directly from some folks in Australia to our managing director of SKC Limited. I think it was last week. Yeah, and Friday of last week. And what the managing director of SKC Limited reported that the testing has begun. Unfortunately, the test house had some problems with their aerosol generation equipment, and they're waiting for some parts to come in, and then the testing will commence again. Trust me, when this is done, I will be screaming it from the highest mountain in Australia, because I know everyone has been asking for this, and I desperately want the data as well. So trust me, you will get it from me. Okay. Other new directions in respirable dust samplers include multi-dust foams for use with the IOM sampler and new SKC Personal Impactors. Those are other new directions, which is the goal of my presentation. Okay. All right. Again, I want to be sure I'm providing enough information for anybody new or somebody new to air sampling. Let me first advise that these multi-dust foam discs allow for simultaneous collection of inhalable and respirable fractions. Okay. The foam discs are inserted into what I call the nose of the IOM, and these foam discs have like pore sizes, right? So they trap the larger particles. They scrub out the big stuff, while the smaller respirable particles pass through and are trapped onto the filter. Now, when I was visiting Australia and New Zealand in December, I received some requests for a report on the performance of the respirable multi-dust samplers, again in comparison to ISO 7708. SKC Limited in the UK advised me that the certificate of conformity shown on this slide, this comes with every single box that you get. It shows the collection efficiency curve in comparison to this European standard, the CEN 481. The specifications in this BS-EN 481 are the same as ISO 7708. The certificate from the UK just says this European standard number. But on the right-hand side, where you see the kind of the circles and then the graph, that is the performance. This is the performance of the multi-dust foam, where you can see the circles where it says foam penetration, relative to the standard, and the line is the CEN 481, which is the same as ISO 7708. Honestly, that was news to me, so I'm happy to pass that on. Okay, as an alternative to Cyclones, SKC has developed new personal impactors for respirable dust. It's nothing crazy. We use impactors for all kinds of particulate sampling. We call these parallel particle impactors, or PPIs. What's parallel? There's 4 inlet holes in parallel. And these are described in the US OSHA final rule on silica as, quote, precisely matching the specifications in ISO 7708. I will tell you, I've been with SKC 33 years now. In my life, I have never seen a sampler as hugely popular as the PPI. We have doubled and tripled our capacity to try and meet the demand for these. The PPI are available in reusable aluminum. Nobody's going with that. They're all going with the single-use disposable model. This is what's shown on the slide. Here you can see the performance of the PPI samplers for use at either 2, 4, or 8 liters a minute, 3 different models, compared to the criteria, the ISO 7708. This data was published in the Journal of Physics, and I can send anybody, or no, I sent all of the handouts to Ivy at AirMet Scientific. So if you want any of the publications, just send them an email, and they will get that to you. Or you can come to me if you have my email. Now, I always say, some people want to fact check me. And so just for fun, I included a copy of the page from the U.S. final rule on silica. Look at the middle column. It says, this is our Federal Register. It says, in addition to cyclone samplers, there are also personal impactors available for use at flow rates from 2 to 8 liters per minute that have been shown to conform closely with the ISO CEN convention. The right-hand column, this was actually highlighted by somebody else. It just says that it exceeds the quantitative detection limit sampling at the designated flow rate. So here's how they work. Instead of centrifugal force that we use in a cyclone for separation, the PPI have 4 internal pre-oiled plates that scrub out the larger particles. In the disposable models, the impactor plates are sonically welded by SKC. You don't have to assemble the plates. You can even buy them preloaded with filters. You don't have to assemble the filters if you don't want to. The pump draws air into the 4 inlet holes where larger particles are scrubbed out and respirable particles collect onto standard PV filters for analysis. Experienced hygienists and beginners. I believe we have a lot of people sampling silica right now in the construction industry that never did this before in the United States with our new rule. They are small. They are easy. They have a handy calibration adapter, so you don't have to use the dreaded hygiene calibration jar. All right, the number one reason, however, that hygienists, honest to God, love the PPI, there is no tipping hazard. Unlike Cyclones, you can invert the PPI without causing large particles to land on the filter, invalidating the sample. I have some hygienists telling me they've had to invalidate like 40% of their samples because the worker accidentally tips it over. So, I mean, this has really honestly been the biggest thing. Disposable PPI samplers are also available in a choice of flow rates, 2, 4, and 8. So you have flexibility in sampling if you want to sample long or short durations, if you are sampling in a high dust load, or whether you're worried about even detecting it. You have a choice of flow rates. Again, you can get them empty if you want your lab to pre-weigh and load it, or if you can just get them pre-loaded with filters if you're just doing chemical analysis for silica. We have sold so many of these in the United States that even the labs were like begging us to sell them pre-weighed because they don't have enough time to pre-weigh the PPIs that they're supplying to all of their clients. So we will be offering them pre-weighed as well soon. Now you may be wondering why the PPI samplers are offered at 4 and 8 liters a minute. We're used to all like Cyclones around 2. I would honestly say that I think NIOSH, they were really the ones that created this impetus for high volume respirable dust samplers. They noted in this publication here that if you are sampling in an environment near TLV concentrations of 25 micrograms per cubic meter, the amount of sample collected at the lower flow rate of 2 liters a minute of most Cyclones may not be enough for quantitative analysis, particularly for shorter sample durations. In the US, OSHA says a minimum sample time of 4 hours is required when you're sampling at 2 liters a minute near levels of 25. What do you do if you don't want to sample 4 hours? Maybe the job isn't lasting 4 hours. So then you can kick up the flow rate to 4 or 8 liters a minute. Okay, for any mining people, I have something, and this could be for anybody, but this was developed for mining people, so I want to share this. This is something brand new from NIOSH. I just sent an email on Friday, April 13th to the inventor to get the latest update for you. NIOSH Mining Division, which coincidentally is in Pittsburgh near SKC, they are developing a new method to do end-of-shift analysis of silica using a portable FTIR. Okay, sample collection is done the old-fashioned way using respirable dust samplers, standard PVC filter, but there will be some sort of specialized cassette to allow the FTIR analysis to be done without removing the filter. At the American Industrial Hygiene Conference in May, NIOSH plans to talk about this at one of the sessions. And again, I'm going to read you what the email I just got from the inventor. He says, I have a platform presentation about the software, but I don't think we will be in a position to announce public availability until the summer. Okay, so what you are going to get from NIOSH, this is so cool. They are developing not only a method, but they will have free software on their website that will allow you to convert the FTIR reading directly from the instrument to silica concentrations. Again, this is not a data logging device throughout the day. This is end of shift sample. And NIOSH has already published on this. And again, I sent the papers to Ivy at AirMet. There's actually 2 papers. One is like on the research and one is on like application. But I think this is so cool, this technology for something direct reading silica. Again, FTIR has a very long name that you can see on the slide. It's spectroscopy. Simply put, it uses infrared light source to measure absorption. Okay. In the US, the portable FTIR units sell for $15,000 to $20,000 US dollars. They are commercially available. I think something like even like Thermo Scientific is one of the suppliers of these units. Okay, moving on. I feel that the next big driver for new directions in air sampling has been the need for occupational hygiene expertise in the indoor environment. You know, compared to the industrial environment, the indoor environment has some differences in how we assess the risk, including hazard definitions, sampler performance based on target levels, and published methods for this area. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's first look at who sets the standards in the workplace versus the indoor environment. This controls a lot of how we do it. In the US, OSHA, NIOSH, and ACGIH really create the standards or guidelines for how we assess hazards in the workplace. In indoor air, however, US EPA has taken the leading role. Why do I say that? It's EPA that's doing the research, EPA doing publications. They are the ones that published a compendium of methods for indoor pollutants, not NIOSH or OSHA. Even the U.S. Green Building Council references EPA definitions and methods in their testing criteria. So, given EPA's leadership in indoor air, particulates in the indoor environment are typically defined as PM10 or PM2.5. You know, our hygiene terms and definitions of inhalable, thoracic, and respirable are not as commonly used. So, consider this. I think it's common for occupational hygiene consultants, you know, to get requests to sample indoor air for particulates. And many of you may not even have samplers for the EPA type criteria of PM10 or PM2.5. Maybe all you have are samplers for inhalable dust and respirable dust. So you wonder, how does the performance of particulate samplers for hygiene compare to those for environmental PM? Well, here is a very beautiful graph given to me by the SKC aerosol physicist, because honestly, I've wondered this myself. This is a very beautiful comparison of the different criteria. Look at the left, and you will see the difference between an ideal, or EPA-defined ideal PM2.5 sampler compared to how hygienists define a respirable dust sampler by ISO 7708. a vastly different performance criteria. You know, the EPA PM 2.5 is not, I wouldn't call that a curve. I'd call that a vertical line. Very different. If we look at EPA PM 10, it's a fairly good match to what hygienists call thoracic particulates, but compared to inhalable, it's not even close. So, in short, if you have to sample indoor environment for PM10 and PM 2.5, and that's what your client is asking you for, you really need a sampler designed for that application and for those methods. The method of reference in the US for PM in the indoor environment is EPA method IP-10A. IP stands for indoor pollutant. This uses, an impactor with a Teflon filter for gravimetric analysis. The sampler that is mentioned in their method is called the PEM, Personal Environmental Monitor. Again, there's different models for use at 2, 4, or 10 liters a minute. This sampler was developed by MSP Corporation and is available through SKC. In recent years, again, SKC has our own aerosol guy. He has developed some new samplers for the EPA PM criteria. What he brings to the table in his design is that you don't have to go to Home Depot and buy machine oil, coat the impaction surface of the sampler to avoid particle bounce, and then have to clean the darn thing. Instead, the new samplers that he developed have pre-oiled impaction substrates, little pieces of almost like a filter support pad that are pre-coated with oil. You just throw them down on the impaction surface, eliminate particle bounce, and when you're done sampling, take them out and throw them away. It's just a little bit of convenience. 2 models are available. The Personal Modular Impactor, shown on the left, is designed for use at 3 liters a minute. The one on the right is designed for flow rates of 10 liters a minute. This so-called impact sampler has been incorporated into a sampler that was requested by the U.S. Army. It has been widely used for sampling our deployed soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why, you ask? Because they are exposed to sandstorms. And sandstorms are PM10, what I call Mother Nature's dust. It always amazes me, considering all of the hazards of war, that our Army would be sampling PM10, but they are. I know direct reading monitors are also available that meet the EPA performance criteria. Here is what we call the EPAM 5000. This is your basic light scattering dust monitor, but what it offers are interchangeable impactors for either PM10 or PM 2.5. It does not do them simultaneously. It's one or the other. It also has the option for concurrent filter sampling using, again, 47 millimeter filters, which are the standard in environmental sampling. This has been a very popular unit, really around the world. Okay. Lastly, I want to discuss something I just found just so darn interesting from the indoor environment. Now, I want to tell you, throughout the year, I keep a file, and I have my file ready for next year AIOH. I call it Fun Facts to Know and Tell. I keep a file of things that I just find interesting. It's all about me. I want to keep myself entertained and knowledgeable. So I keep a file on things that honestly I learn from other professionals when I go to conferences and I hear other people talk about things in sampling. And I think, oh, I want to share those the next time I go to Australia. And this was one that I added last year. It's kind of a simple subject, but I found it so interesting. Okay, faced with complaints of sick building syndrome, most hygienists would turn to the likely suspects shown here on this list: CO2, formaldehyde, mold, VOCs. But I learned in my course that I attended, there is a lesser known culprit, generally called glass fibers, including the materials that you see there on the slide. Okay, now these generic glass fibers that we're talking about here are not the small respirable ones like asbestos that cause disease 40 years from now. No, these fibers are large enough to evoke a complaint now. The concern is simply irritation to the building occupant. Aspect ratio is not a critical factor like it is in asbestos. Fiber length, may play a role in the irritation, the health effect. And again, I show the reference here. I did send the copy of the paper to airmen if you want to have a look at it. It's very interesting. Okay, here's a list of some of the sources of glass fibers in the indoor environment. I'm sure this photo looks familiar to all of us. We've all seen ceiling tiles with that same brown stain. Now, the hygienist who gave a presentation on this subject noted, you may find this problem in schools because young school children, they do their little coloring projects, they're painting things, and they're putting them on hooks, and they're hanging them from the little brackets that hold the ceiling tiles. All right? Well, guess what? This causes the glass fibers to break off and become airborne. So building occupants exposed to glass fiber filters may experience a number of health effects in the short term. Anybody who's ever walked through their own attic may have felt skin or eye irritation if you were exposed to fiberglass insulation. I do the health and safety for the SKC factory. We blow in glass wool separators in those tubes. And this was many years ago. I had people complaining that they were so itchy and their skin was so irritated. We had to end up installing engineering controls on every single one of our sorbent tube manufacturing areas because of these glass fibers. But again, looking at this list of health effects, who would think glass fibers? I'd be thinking mold, you know what I mean, VOCs, something. Okay, so how do we sample glass fibers? Air sampling using the same methods as asbestos could be done. That's what I did when I had the issue at SKC. I got my 25 millimeter black conductive cassettes. I followed NIOSH 7400 for asbestos and other fibers, and I did air sampling. I didn't really get anything, but still people were irritated. So these researchers in the paper that I referenced suggested that surface sampling using lift tape technique is the preferred method. They found that health effects correlate well with surface concentrations and not airborne levels. And in my history, I would say the same thing in the health and safety program at SKC. I'm sure many of you have done or heard of lift tape sampling for mold. Same technique here. Common methods employ 3M brand magic tape, followed by microscopic examination. SKC has flexible microscopic slides, actually with the same 3M brand tape. It's an adhesive area, but it's on a flexible microscopic slide. So you can press the slide against the wall, pull, or on the tabletop, wherever you think there's fibers or mold. And then there is a handy plastic mailer to send it to the laboratory. And I call these stick-to-its. Okay, so that is my presentation for today. I think we'll have some time if anybody has any questions. I really thank you for your attention, and thank you to AirMet Scientific for arranging this transcontinental webinar. I find it really fun to talk to you, and I hope to see some of you at the American Conference in May.
Well, thanks everyone for attending today, and thanks Debbie for your time. It's always entertaining, very informative, and a really interesting presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good night.